Hey wise listeners, and welcome back to another episode of our Wise Words book summaries. Today we are going to be summarising Selfie by Will Storr, which tries to explore the self from the perspective of the West in terms of individualism and in particular perfectionism. To give a brief summary, the book starts by looking at the biological factors that make up the self and how the components operate in a tribal environment. After covering the biological and evolutionary aspects of the self, Will Storr then attempts to trace individualism back to its cultural origins, back to ancient Greece where the idea of perfectionism was first created, and where status was measured by one's external qualities, such as competing in bouts of strength in the Olympic Games. However, this approach did not last forever, and during the medieval religious periods, this idea of individualism was inverted, focusing more on trying to suppress any urge for pleasure and instead perfect one's self-control. Naturally, as the scientific movement increased, this approach in individualism was taken on board by Sigmund Freud, who tried to explain these natural urges in relation to the unconscious. This concept was then linked to the Eastland Institute in California during the 1960s, where the approach to the self was to accept these natural urges and strip away anything blocking their expression. This was considered the authentic self, and it was this that needed to be supported and encouraged, which ultimately led to the self-esteem movement. One of the followers of this approach to the self was a man named John Vasconcello, a politician in the state of California who believed that low self-esteem was the reason for high unemployment, crime, and more. He used his political power to coerce and bully researchers into publishing results that would back up his ideas and make him sound more credible. This ultimately led the government to introduce legislation where schools were encouraged to improve children's self-esteem by rewarding them whether or not they deserved it. This, however, had the complete opposite effect, as the psychologist Roy Baumeister pointed out that inflated or uncalibrated self-esteem can lead to an increase in narcissism. An individual with inflated self-esteem may perceive themselves differently to those who perceive them, and this mismatch can lead to conflict and, in some cases, aggression. At the same time as this, the economic climate was changing, whereby privatization was emphasized and the markets were given more power. The neoliberal age was about, and people now had the freedom to compete. However, because this coincided with the self-esteem movement, it meant that the market was then saturated by people high in narcissism. This explains the state of the world today, where people have high self-esteem and yet cannot provide evidence to support it. We are a product of our own individualistic ideology towards the self. As the rift between what we believe we can do and what we can actually do increases, we learn that we are incapable of growth and reject the self entirely. Instead, we should accept our strengths and weaknesses and improve on them in order to have a calibrated self-esteem, one that is rooted in truth. Jes and I touch on each one of these topics with the odd detour now and then just to mix it up. Unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties, we cut out halfway through, but we rectified this issue in post. We hope that you enjoy it. It is a fascinating read which gives you a lot to think about, especially as the number of people on social media is constantly increasing, and so is the need to portray oneself as perfect. If you enjoy it, you know what to do. Give us a like or leave us a comment so that we can know what you thought about it. Also, make sure to subscribe to our channel so that you can be made aware when we next bring out another episode. But until then, here is Selfie by Will Storr.
And do you want to take us away, or do you want me to start?
Yeah, I'll give like a bit of an overview, just in the sense that Will Storr tries to basically approach perfectionism and individualism, and tries to understand it from kind of like a biological point, or like what are the biological factors for it. And then most of the book is about the cultural aspects. And so he basically goes back to ancient Greece and then through medieval religious periods, and then in California during the 60s and 70s up until now, like Silicon Valley. So he kind of like goes through different periods and tries to explain how they all have an impact on one another and how they all influence kind of individualism and perfectionism.
Yeah. How I guess another way of putting it is how the self relates to culture, or how the self is perceived in relation to culture over time, right? I think is essentially the core idea of the book. It's how has, the idea of who we are as an individual within culture changed from the ancient Greek Greeks to now. And he started. What was the first chapter again? It was the dying self, right? And why
So
was
the dying self?
What was it about the dying self?
So basically, he talked a lot about suicide.
Oh yes,
and how basically what we end up doing in the West is we end up giving ourselves a lot of like high standards that we can't meet, or inflicting standards on other people which they can't meet. So for being a man or a woman in society, you need to be a man, you have to tick all these boxes, right? Yeah. But it's quite hard, and maybe more boxes come into play. And so it's hard to get to that point, and so you can't reach that standard. So yourself kind of gives up trying, in a sense. It's like, oh, I can't get there. I keep trying and I keep failing. To be this perfect idea of what a man is or a woman.
I think he had a really interesting idea, which is like, when we're always trying to figure out the best behaviors from early, right? In terms of when we're like analyzing the way social situations work from when we're young, we're trying to scour the environment for the behaviors that allow people to give you like respect. So it allows you to, I think he phrased it something like, the behaviors that allow you to get ahead and what was it? And be respected, or something. It was something like that. And that a lot of our,
to fit in and to excel, basically.
Yeah. So we're always looking for these like models of behavior, or models to look up to base our own behavior on. And I guess within this chapter, his point was, we've now set the bar so high, and I think this could be a level of like the sort of Peterson type aspect, where it's, we've got the phones now, so we can see models for everything. We can see models for like the best standard of beauty, the models for the best standard of strength, the models for this and that, for any type of thing that humans can excel at, right? And then you can now compare yourself to all these models of almost perfection in specific areas. And that has made the standards so high of comparison. And we always think comparatively in terms of where we are in life, right? We like, how would you ever know where you stand unless you can see where the goalposts are, if that makes sense? And
you need something to compare to, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought it was quite interesting, because I never really thought of the whole suicide thing as well as a form of like social perfectionism. And that's kind of what his point was, wasn't it? It was like, these standards are so high, and people hold themselves to these standards and believe that if they don't hit these standards, then socially people aren't going to like them, or they feel rejected in their mind, even though it might not be the case that they are being rejected socially, but they believe it in themselves. They believe that, like, they're not living up to the potential, or they can't be the perfect person, if that makes sense. They can't be the model that they've given themselves the aim of achieving. And I think he talks about it. Roy Baumeister talks a lot about this idea that suicide actually is an escape from the self, is an escape from these what's the best way of phrasing it? Ever compressing like standards that you give yourself. And I think I never really thought about it, that it was this idea that, is a form of perfectionism where you basically hold yourself to a high standard, which is just unachievable. And you kind of beat yourself up to the point where, you lose just, well, I was going to say lose self-esteem, but you lose the willingness to sort of be you.
You lose faith in your ability, really.
Yeah, I think that was it, right? Yeah, it was lose
and to repair anything that's wrong.
Yeah, I thought that was it was a pretty dark start. To be honest, you could have actually had that sort of chapter at the end, because you started off with the idea of the dying self right at the beginning, right? Whereas that doesn't, like, that started in the present rather than starting in the past. But I think he set it up to show like how far we've come.
But I guess it's more contextually relevant.
Yeah, I think, and also it was kind of to show where we are now, and it's like, how have we got to this point where so many people are committing suicide, or where where is a common cause of death now from it compared to in the past, right? Like, how have we got to this point where the self, or like people are rejecting their self essentially to kill themselves?
Yeah.
He talks about perfectionism as a scale. And I quite like this idea that some people are more sensitive than others to specific cues in the environment, and therefore that's part of the perfectionism scale, isn't it? They're way more, their attention is way more focused on slight deviations from this ideal model. Let's just put it that way. where some people just don't care. There's like chill people who just couldn't give a couldn't get less of a fuck, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Like he mentioned like different types of perfectionism. So social perfectionism, the idea to meet to social standards. Then there's like internal perfectionism, basically like the self, like the standards that you create for yourself. And then he mentioned neurotic perfectionism, and that's exactly what you were just saying. Basically, people differing on the scale of being more sensitive to certain kind of cues in the environment of like chaos, I guess you could say. But it's what I found interesting, and what I kind of linked to Shattered Assumptions. Remember in Shattered Assumptions, she was talking about characterological and behavioral self-blame.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That neurotic people, they just generalize their behavior, being like, "Oh, I couldn't do that, so I can't do anything like that."
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean? So it's the characterological. Yeah. It's not like in that specific context. It's like, "Oh, I couldn't meet a new person, so I can never meet a new person."
Yes.
You get what I mean? So that's kind of their kind of mentality.
Yeah, they generalize from the one thing that happens to them. So they're like, it generalizes essentially to the self. Like it generalizes to you as a being, and obviously that's going to damage your reputation with yourself to have confidence in yourself going forward, right? And that's kind of the point of what you're saying with the dying self, which is you've basically lost all faith in yourself to be able to come back from where you're at in this position, whatever, and therefore there's no other option. You feel trapped, right?
Exactly, and it makes sense in the sense that you are going to have people that differ. First of all, biologically, some people might be more sensitive at picking up certain details, but also people that like their self has developed in a certain way, and based on their personality, which he goes into later on in the book, and how these all are kind of factors in how we deal with, our certain standards that we give for ourselves, which I guess is kind of a good segue to lead into like the biological roots of which he talks in, unless you had more about this chapter.
No, that was me done. The rest I moved into my next notes about reputation and gossip, but we'll get into that in a minute. You riff on the biological.
Yeah. Well, I was just like, one of the first things that he kind of says is how basically as your brains develop, and especially as a child, and especially since you've like just been born, your brain starts to prune synapses and neural pruning, basically. So your brain is basically trying to adapt to the environment, literally, right? So it like floods itself with neurons, and then it goes, okay, what bits of the brain are we using the most? And this is kind of a reflection of the environment and what's going on in the environment. So then it starts to prune all the things that's not getting used, right? So this is, I think, where he tries to kind of lead into this whole how culture can like shape our brains and shape our behavior and shape the self, because the brain already starts to adapt unbelievably well at such a young age, up until basically like 5 to 7, and then you kind of then it starts to pretty much solidify. But
No, that's the same sort of like argument for like plasticity, isn't it? It's like it starts off more. Apparently, actually, though, humans are remarkably their neurons are remarkably plastic, even at an older age in comparison to other animals. Apparently, I think he actually put that in the cultural animal. But like you're saying, when you're younger, there is way more flexibility than there is when you're older, and this is hence the reason like the bilingual brain you read, where it's like as a child, your ability to hear different frequencies of noise, you can pick up different languages or the variations in language much more easily than an adult can, because like you're probably thinking like the pruning's already happened, like the stuff that's relevant has already been sort of zoned in on, so you know exactly what to listen to in the language, you know the different sort of tones and pitches or whatever, and you've done it already. Whereas if I guess you're living in like a multilingual culture, or where in a family which speaks more than one language, you can hear so many different ones that your brain's going to keep hold of them because they're still relevant in the environment, right?
Exactly. And then he kind of dives into the whole evolutionary approach of tribalism and how which do you want to talk about for a bit?
So in this chapter, if I remember it correctly, he talked a lot about a gangster, wasn't it? It was a gangster in London. Am I right to think that, or it was somebody like that?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And I think this chapter in general started talking about the idea that the self is inherently, well, I guess tribal is the word, but like developed culturally, in the sense that he's saying here that you basically listen, or you observe, like a bit like we were saying earlier, you listen and observe tribal gossip and the way people talk about specific behaviors and specific people, and you use this tribal influence / gossip to inform yourself on the best ways to behave in the group, or you kind of, from these stories of what's going on within the tribe, you learn the best behaviors to not be ridiculed in a weird way, because half the reason of the gossip and this reputational discussions within a tribal group is basically villainizing some people and heroizing some people, if I remember correctly, because you can't really have a story about, an antagonist and a protagonist, right? From this information, we develop this idea of the model self within that group of people to behave. And I found that quite interesting, because if you think about it, you're actually nested in so many different mini tribes within your life that there actually is different cultures or rules or ideal selves you have to be in these different situations, if that makes sense. Because I guess that's what culture is in a weird way. Like, if you go to a doctor, there's a specific code of behavior to a degree, and that is based upon the idea of the ideal doctor, or whatever, for example, or even within friendship groups, right? You could say the same. There's this unspoken ideal friend that we've all kind of constructed in our heads to a degree, and then we try and match that behavior, let's just say. So, like, for example, if you're within a friendship group, this is why the self's tribal, and somebody was saying, or somebody's ridiculing a particular behavior that they've witnessed or seen, you will then know from that discussion / gossip that this person does not like it when this behavior is done. Therefore, you now have valuable information to not do that thing again. And it's quite interesting, because this is the first book where we've talked about like the sort of what's the elephant in the brain and sort of like gossip reputation, or that, why was it relevant? And then I kind of realized actually this is quite cool, because actually what it does as well is, if you gossip, you kind of inform people how you expect them to behave. You kind of inform people what you expect from them, or what you value, or what you value or what you don't value, what your values are, because by discussing what happens, you're creating the story of what the right and wrong, where your line is, if that makes sense. Because it was talking about how there's another crucial point about reputation, is that we're self-conscious creatures, so we're constantly watching ourselves, judging ourselves, just as people are judging us. So when we catch ourselves behaving in a particular way, we can self monitor, essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
That's it. No, the point was basically, and I don't think it's kind of relevant to the reputation. It's like, we don't really crave reputation from others. We crave it from ourselves to a degree, because we are self-conscious. So we now know the rules that people are sort of creating in this culture, because we can see what people punish, what people reward, etc. Right? So you then know that people are going to reward you for that. So therefore you can hold yourself accountable, and therefore you have to not only impress others, but yourself, because you know within yourself if you're behaving in the right way. And weirdly enough, that could actually be what consciousness evolved for. I need to read more books on it, but
exactly. I think you have an external means of basically knowing how to act within a hierarchy, right? So you've got gossip that will tell you about the rules and the people to try and mimic to basically succeed. But you also have, like, those rules in a sense get internalized, don't they? And so you end up acting in accordance with those. And when you don't, that's when you're like, you're self-conscious, because you're made aware that you're either acting in accordance with these rules or you're not. So you almost have an internal means of readjusting yourself, as well as this external gossip means.
I think on a weird side note with the self-consciousness thing. So like, I thought as well, what if I think there's also, people who have fragile egos who respond to sort of comments and make them feel self-conscious, and they respond really aggressively. Is it possibly because that they deep down have a consciousness, or they know it's true? Like, do you kind of get what I mean? Like, if somebody said to me, like, "Oh, you're fat," or something like that, because I'm really far from fat, I wouldn't to ever take possibly any offense to it. So my consciousness almost goes, "Yeah, that's not true. Don't even contemplate it." Whereas there is a level of it which is like when you kind of know something's true, you become, if you find yourself doesn't want to believe it, it wants to believe something else. And you're kind of bending the truth a little bit, and your consciousness knows you're bending the truth. So when somebody reminds you of the shortcoming, you can kind of agree, or you can kind of see it. I don't know does that make any sense?
Yeah, I get you. Like, I think first of all, it depends in this example whether you are fat or not.
Mm-hmm.
But then it also depends whether you fear being fat or not. So you may not actually be fat, but someone tells you you're fat, and then you're like, oh, but that's like my biggest insecurity because that's something I can't deal with.
Okay, good point. Yeah.
So yeah, there's I think an element of being like calibrated in that sense, and also I think that something has to do with, if I'm having a conversation with you, I don't expect you to suddenly just insult me, right? Like, so there's an element of like openness and trust to someone else. You kind of want them to work on the same rules that you would. So you kind of want to be trusting of what they say. And if they suddenly say, oh, you're fat, then there's a discrepancy between whether you believe in them or whether, so there's like this kind of, I guess, friction between the two.
Yeah.
Because you want to be able to just trust everyone. But then obviously some people are fucking dickheads and they're going to go around calling you fat.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
No. Sorry, that was kind of off topic, but yeah, I thought it's just interesting. I think on a side note as well, we should definitely go into some consciousness-based books, possibly after the next few. I think it'd be quite an interesting topic to go into, especially from like a evolutionary perspective. Let's just say, And then what else? The one other thing I got from this chapter in terms of the tribal self was this idea that selfishness and selflessness are nested within a tribe. And I thought that was really interesting, this idea that, the idea of, a behavior which is selfish vis selfless is dependent upon the people who you're being selfish or selfless towards. Like the idea that this guy in the chapter who he was describing was a London gang leader or something who basically used to brutalize people or whatever, but he believed he was selfless because he was providing for his tribe, his boys, for his tribe. So he believed in himself to be a selfless, kind person who, gives to everybody, but to everybody else, he's selfish because he's accumulating all these resources, power, whatever, and keeping it for himself. And obviously he's dishing out to his friends, but like, it's selfish in the sense it doesn't help the grand society, let's just say. But what I found interesting about that in particular is it reminds me of the fraud videos I've been watching with the CoffeeZilla, who caught out some basic influencers. And when he was like saying to them, like, can you not see you're being fraudulent here? Can you not see that you're doing stuff which is like ripping off your fans? And their first argument was always, but I bought my friend a car. Like I gave my family this. I gave my friends this. Like I'm a generous person. Look at me. I'm giving away so much money to my friends. And it's quite interesting how that's how people can distort being selfish essentially for the tribe.
Yeah. Exactly, because it depends on the reference point that you're comparing yourself to, or your actions to, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. It's basically defined, like culture does define you in a sense. Because what I found interesting is he was, just a quote from him. He's basically saying that, when you're born, your brain needs to know, like obviously it basically, its number one thing is to survive until you can reproduce pretty much. But it needs to I wonder if it needs to have a goal to go towards. And this is this ideal self. It needs to understand and soak up so much information from around you to be like, okay, what is the best way to survive in this environment, right? And so that's why it will start to take on these rules from these cultures and be like, this is the ideal self that they hold. So like you want to be perfect, but your culture defines what perfect is or what the ideal self is.
But this is why you get cultural bubbles within society and classes in my head. Like it's almost like the natural, if you have people who want to differentiate between people, I mean, obviously there's certain things like language, right? I mean, if somebody comes in and starts speaking like Arabic to you, you're going to be like, well, they're obviously not within the same exact culture I've been in, even if they've lived in the UK or whatever, like, because there is a slight difference. And then there's other things, like you said, I was just trying to say, like upbringing, for example, I think a lot of with like the private school stuff, they try and teach like specific, like I was going to say like politeness or like over politeness, but then you can kind of see just from dealing with people based on their behaviors how they've been brought up, and you kind of know then they're going to play the same rules. Like you're saying a minute ago, like you in a conversation with somebody like that, they're not going to insult you mid sentence, because if they do, then they're not. They've just basically displayed that they're not really part of that rule group or playing by the same rules, right? And it's like I said to you before, like with like the shattered assumptions or whatever, not being able to predict, it's people on the street who are acting a bit weird. The reason why you're scared of them is because you're like, that guy is not predictable. Like almost, I guess one of the
from my tribe.
One of the functions of the culture, like basically programming us, is it makes each other predictable to each other, if that makes sense. And then we use gossip and reputation, in my opinion, to rein in people who try and push the boundaries. Yeah, keep people in check. That is literally it. We need to be put into check, because with that we can then trust each other to trade, to work together. And if we know we're all playing by the same rules, and we've seen like this person, in this local vicinity, he's not fucking around he's not going to place to place to place. He's literally stuck in this town for 50 years of his life. He's not going to like rip you off because he's invested in being here or whatever. But yeah, I was trying to think where I was going with that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because like the means that one uses to try and get to this ideal self, right? Depending on what hierarchy you're in, or what, whether that's to be the best doctor or just to be the best, I don't know, whatever hierarchy you're in. But basically, you end up, you have to understand the ideal self, you have to first understand yourself, right? And he kind of talks about that in this chapter, whereby you have like to become the ideal self, your brain basically assimilates all your kind of like sensory information, your emotional experiences and your memories, and then basically puts that all into a monologue, like an inner monologue, and then basically talks to you about it. So you can kind of justify all of your actions. And it's like, I don't know, it's a bit trippy because you're kind of like justifying your past and almost creating your future at the same point. Do you get what I mean? And so your self will be basically an accumulation of things that have been rejected and things that have been accepted and manipulated to basically fit with what you've done before and where you're going.
Sense. No, it does make sense.
And then he started talking about that the left brain interpreter.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? Because I made like notes to Master and His Emissary. I still haven't read the book. But,
even Elephant in the Brain has that sort of talk, which is like the left brain interpreter is essentially like the PR department. It's almost like this is what's just happened. How can I find a cultural reason, a culturally acceptable reason for whatever's just happened that people will understand and allow me to, like, to be honest, it could be anything from an action which is normal, which is going to the shops. A culturally acceptable answer to that would be like, I'm going to the shops because I want to have food for next week, and everybody would just be like, yeah, okay, fair enough. Like, but then if you did something bad, what's quite interesting is that PR system will work and be like, right, okay, what have I learned from all the stories that my culture's telling me? What is the best way to frame what I've just done? Let's just say I've stolen something. What is the best way to frame the fact that I've just stolen this and I've been caught stealing? Is it the fact that I'm running late for the train? Like, is that an acceptable excuse? And that is literally I genuinely believe that's how people think when they get caught in those situations. It's like, what is the most reasonable excuse I can give right now to, try and persuade them, if anything, that I'm not a bad person. I'm, this is, what's happened to me. I've just decided to do this because there's like extraneous circumstances which are causing me to behave in a way which is, bad. I guess alcohol could be a use for a lot of people. Just be like, oh yeah, I was drunk. It's just like, and everybody's like, oh yeah, he's just drunk. It's not his fault. He's like, grappling women. He's like a sex pest. He's just drunk, And the only reason I'm saying that is because there was, I was watching like Andrew Cuomo guy, whatever. Have you ever heard of him? I think he's the New York mayor. I probably butchered that. Anyway, he's been done for like multiple cases of sexual harassment. And then the guy who was analyzing him was like, actually, he's a kind of a genius, because basically whenever he greets anybody, he kind of like grabs them on the head and kisses their forehead. So like he does this to men, women, everybody. But the guy was like, he's a genius because he's found out a way to have plausible deniability to grope people or to like try and kiss people. It's like he's getting done for like multiple cases of trying to kiss women or something from doing this. You get what I mean? It's just like, oh my God. It's just people are like deceptively smart with that type of thing, where they try and use the a culturally acceptable reason. Oh, I do it to everybody. Sorry, sidetracked a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting there. Yeah, because you will, and think about how many times that, because also it's like a non-conscious process. So the reasons why we actually give ourselves may not be the true reasons for why we're doing it. That's why it comes into the whole elephant in the brain, because you've got underlying motives that maybe you're not even conscious of.
But sometimes I think you might be conscious of it, and you kind of know why you're doing it.
Yeah.
Like, for example, you're probably stealing because you can't be bothered to pay for something because you'd just much rather have it for free, right? But you then spin it in a way. So, like, don't get me wrong, I do believe there's cases where you don't actually know why you're acting, and I do agree with that. But I think sometimes there is calculated, and I guess that's what gets punished in law the most, where it's like
absolutely
calculated, like there was motive behind your action, and you're basically trying to catch out cheats, essentially, or liars, with that type of with that type of regulation, etc.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But yeah, what else do I have next? I think.
All right. Well, that was pretty much all I had.
I don't.
That chapter,
what was the next one? Was it? So the next one was.
So then there's predictable self.
No, the perfectible self, and that.
So basically, I think about Greece. I think.
Yeah, I might have something before. Yeah, it was Greece, mate. It was.
No, predictable self.
I've actually got some more stuff. Are you sure it's predictable? I've got perfectable in the book here. Are you sure?
The dying tribal predictable.
Wait, no way. I got the perfectable. I swear on my life,
I'm pretty sure.
It's only because it's
the perfectable is later on.
No, I
good, bad, and then. Oh my God! Wait, yeah, no, it is perfectible. That's also a predictable one.
There is no predictable.
Fair enough.
That sounds a bit like predictable. Would have made sense.
I was confused when I was making notes earlier on. I was like, I swear, you didn't talk about.
The predictable would make sense in terms of from the inside.
I've read a completely different book.
Yeah. The predictable would make sense. Actually, I actually genuinely think you should put it in as a chapter for explaining why culture is used evolutionary to like make people predictable to each other. I think that's an insight you probably didn't mention. I've still actually got a few. We did talk about the self being a story, didn't we? Like the idea that you have like a monologue that goes on. I think looking at this, he talks about this is before the perfectible self. By the way, this is just more notes I have from the tribal. He talks about what we said before, where we use the stories within our culture. So like, what's reviled and what's not, or whatever, usually informs people of how what the ideal looks like. What's this? He talks about like stories being used to understand reality, and I made a note here and a link to like Peterson stuff, whereas like hell isn't a place. Hell is kind of like a way of understanding your reality if you're in a state of like perpetual fear of like people. I don't know, like tormented, right? It's not like a scientific place. It's like a experiential place. So I got that as a note, and then we live our lives in story mode. We said that we confabulate, yes, as well as it often. Okay. And then
I linked to him. I found him really interesting when I thought it was interesting when he was talking about how like you mentioned this earlier, but literally how like when people talk about you in gossip, they have to use like a story format, because how else do you talk about someone? And so then you're assimilated into either a hero or a villain. And then depending on which one of those
a narrative story format being person, and
then your flaws and your attributes are like magnified depending on whether you're the hero or the villain. So it's like,
but then there's also other ones. I was thinking about this. There's also other stories. So it's like, fine, there is heroes and villain stories, but there's also like embarrassing stories. Do you get me? Like, there's almost stories you say to be like, oh my God, like he did this, and not to be like he's a bad person, but like that is so embarrassing for him. Do you like? But you almost use that as like an example of like when somebody's embarrassed, they've kind of broken a rule, or they've done something so outside of the cultural rules that you're like, oh my God, like people are going to look at him like he's weird, right? Kind of thing. Or so I guess you almost, that in a weird way, once again, is almost like a reinforcement of that is wrong to do, because if it's embarrassing, it's technically wrong to do in culture, right? In my head. Or it's not wrong, but it's, it's frowned upon in culture. It's like, oh my God, like he made us such a mistake that's just like, oh, like cringe kind of thing. which is actually interesting as well, because like a lot of TV programs, if you look at it through this lens, like the in-betweeners being cringe humor, like it almost teaches you like the rules, like because it's just outrageous situations that you'd never see within culture, if that kind of makes sense. Some like the situations within in-betweeners, you'd be like, oh my god, like I can't believe they've done that. But the only reason that's so entertaining is because it's literally reinforcing your culture against that, like the expectations of normality around the program. But yeah. Right. Let's move on to the perfectible self then.
Yeah.
I didn't get too many notes on this. I think the main thing I took away was this idea that I think it was Greek, wasn't it? It was Greece, where they created a realm of proto-entrepreneurialism, Jesus, where travel, novelty, and debate was to form the beginning of what Professor Werner Jaeger calls the new conception of the value of the individual. And I think what happened in this sort of period of time is they started realizing everybody had some level of potential, I think is probably the best way of explaining it.
Yeah.
And people could train themselves to improve and to be better. And this was kind of was the cornerstone the right word? Or the start of the idea that the self, people individually can improve and become better at things and achieve, the stuff of dreams almost.
Yeah. To add on that, like, I think basically like the Greeks kind of believed that if you defined and categorized something's like cause and effect, like an object's cause and effect, then you could be able to predict it, right? If you knew that an apple fell from a tree and it hit the ground, then you could predict it. So with things that change and things that you understand their cause and effect, you can start to improve. And if something can be improved, then it can be perfected. And I think that's where like Aristotle Plato, I think, starts to try and understand what's the ideal city.
I guess that's the start of knowledge almost, right? The start of science, you can call it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so by understanding everything, because it was all atomized, wasn't it? Like you're starting from the very beginning. But then Aristotle basically took that to humans and was like, well, how do you perfect a human? What is the ideal citizen?
Yes, yeah.
And that is why I think, also at the same time you had Greece, the Greek Empire, like growing loads, and it was, very rich. And I found it interesting. He also talked about this thing called geography of thought.
Yes, Eastern and Western, the differences, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. This idea that like your geography, reflects, or your culture reflects your geography.
Yes, culture.
Greece is made up of loads of islands. And is very kind of individualistic and promoted like individual growth, especially in skills and perfecting it. And, that was your status, being the people who competed in the Olympic Games and things like that. Whereas like in Asia, you've just got vast amounts of land and they take a completely more like collective approach, which I thought was quite interesting. But basically Greek were the ones that kind of promoted this kind of individual growth and how you can perfect yourself through acquiring skills. And
yeah, I think on that side note of the East and the West, there was a few interesting things I got from that, and one of them was, like you said, the idea that the philosophy kind of the West was more individualistic, atomized, separate, and then the sort of underlying philosophy of the East was more collective, situation based. So the argument being like, if somebody was to blame somebody in the West for something, it'll be based on their personality, it'll be based on the individual and their motives, and it's basically all blames like just on the person, whereas apparently in the East is more situational based, like this is where he is, this is the situation that was happening, so it's more about situation than it is about the individual. And then I think another note I took was this idea that in the West that we seek to bravely conquer the forces of change, whilst in the East their goal is harmony. I thought that's quite interesting.
I thought that was really interesting.
No, it is. It's 100% because there's different goals if you think about it. Like one of them's like progressing and overpowering reality or taking control. One of them's more about living within and trying to get harmony in the world rather than trying to control it. If that makes sense, it's like almost you're at a whim to reality. So we're trying to like flow with life rather than trying to like manipulate it, control it. And they are two separate goals in my head. Two separate objectives. You can't really go with the flow and keep harmony if you're trying to dictate how things are changing or moving.
Yes, exactly. I thought that was really interesting, especially how, like, if everyone is doing their duty within a collective, then it will be harmony. There will be balance. Whereas, like, not so much if everyone is in their own lane, just trying to. They'll all be at different, like, points in their own lane in individual or Western societies, and that, like, they kind of talked about that with stories and how that kind of their stories reflected this, whereby in the West you have an individual, a hero who overcomes adversity, defeats, the villain and evil, and truth and love, and prosper. Whereas, like, in Eastern stories, it's more about, like, getting back to harmony. Sacrificing, and the obstacle is something that will get you back to harmony.
You just reminded me, I took something really interesting as well. That was a really interesting point, like how stories differ. And then he mentioned something like in the East, stories don't have endings. Did you get that bit? He's like, stories don't have endings. They kind of leave it open-ended for the person to interpret how things happen or something. And I was like, what the, I would love to. I think we should read that book, isn't it? The Geography of Thought, I think it's called. That could be one we go into sooner rather than later, because that was just super interesting to me. That because if you think about it, all films literally in the West that is follow roughly the same archetypal story path, right? Even if it's like you just said, it's the power of love comes through, or the power of the hero who goes against adversity and overcomes it. And it's the Peter said, isn't it? It's like there's a stability, chaos comes into the hero fights chaos to confronts it, and then stability is restored, kind of thing, isn't it? Whereas I'm trying to struggle, I guess, how the archetype of the East would be. It'd be like, I wouldn't, if there is, I guess, balancing chaos with what's going on and just realizing there's no way out, and then you got to find the middle ground between the two. No idea. I'd probably have to understand some languages before I could watch a film. Actually, I guess you could just watch a film, couldn't you?
But it's interesting. I wonder whether you would still take away the same stuff from like an Eastern story or an Eastern film if you're from a Western culture.
That's a good point. If your brain is literally structured to perceive events in that way.
Yeah.
If you perceive events in that structure, because that's like you're saying, if we gossip like that as well, like something happens to this person either does something or whatever and overcomes or whatever, obviously a villain or whatever, there's always that kind of same structure. I don't know, you'd have to, I guess, watch a couple of these films and see if you take away or you can appreciate the difference, maybe.
Yeah.
But I think maybe though, if you coming from the knowledge of this, you would probably be more open-minded to it, possibly.
Yeah, I think so. It'd just be quite interesting to see whether you would want the hero in the story to do certain things that they're not, because that's not their goal, All right, so we had a bit of a technical difficulty there, but we're back, and I think we're pretty much at the end of the perfectible self, just talking about the differences between the Eastern and Western kind of approach to life, or the self. So the next chapter is book 3, The Bad Self. So this is when he was exploring the religious aspect, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So after the kind of decline of the Greek Empire, and how basically some of those teachings were kind of reversed, and so instead of trying to achieve perfection externally through skills and everything like that, it was kind of being able to conquer your internal self, wasn't it? In the sense of like not needing to show off, not needing all of these external attributes. Instead, you could just be at peace with yourself, or at least that's kind of what I got.
No, that is exactly kind of what it was, and it was. Would it even be arguing like conquering? I mean, wasn't the point of the bad self this idea that it moved away that we were all like inherently sinners, like the self itself was bad, and therefore we needed to subject ourselves to the whim of God and live according to the rules of the religion at the time, which I believe was Christianity. But it's this idea that from like a fall from grace of everybody is perfect, everybody's or everybody, so people could be perfect. Sorry, maybe that's the best way of putting it. More, we're all fallen angels. We're all deeply flawed, and there are specific ways we have to live to to repent the bad that we do, essentially.
Yeah. I thought it was funny when he was exploring. He was like, I wonder if religion has like, you know, any kind of roots in from like, you know, the Greek perspective. And then he was like, as I looked at the Jesus who was ripped and had these abs, and like he was like, there we go, you know, the perfect body.
That's it, the perfect human, right?
And I guess I was just thinking of Rick and Morty, you know, when Jesus is just like absolutely fucking shredded. And
yeah.
Funny. But yeah, no, I thought what was interesting is, once again, going back to that idea that your culture kind of reflects your geography or your environment. Yeah. You know, during the medieval times, it was pretty rough. You know, you didn't have a state in that sense. And, you know, you had to try and survive. And the best way to doing that was kind of being like pledging to your lord, your literal lord who looks after your land, but then also pledging to a very religious sense of that. So in this case, like Catholicism. And yeah, it was quite interesting because like pure belief in that reflects the kind of internal like perfection, in a sense. The more you believe in that, the more you can perfect your internal self, the better you are, in a sense, rather than the external version of just trying to accumulate more and more status.
Yeah.
Which I think is quite interesting.
If I remember correctly as well, it was in the chapter he went and stayed with some monks, didn't he? And he was talking about this idea of abstinence, and he was, I think he was trying to find the philosophy behind why somebody would almost like inflict pain on themselves. Because I remember it's something like he's talking to one of the monks. It's like we don't actually enjoy doing this. It's just like the cost. It's like the cost we pay to not be a sinner. It's like, okay,
I tried hard not to judge in this chapter, and I found it hard because just like I just couldn't imagine committing my whole life to an, I don't want to say an ideology, but in a sense it is, of just, you know, purging yourself from any kind of pleasure because you are a sinner.
Yeah. Well,
it is just
you're like, bad. The part of you that craves it is the bad self. Like the fact you get pleasure is sin. Pleasure is sin.
It's another Rick and Morty one. Remember when they're like,
when they're down in hell, when they're like flying. He's like, "What's
that up? Hurts, which gives me pleasure, which gives me pain, which gives me pleasure."
That's it. Funny. Oh, it is funny. I'm trying to think what else I really got from that chapter. I didn't really get too much. I less so agreed. Wow, I'm not even agreeing. I feel like this was almost like a detour. The whole bad self part was like, it shows that, you know, we started off with this Greek, improve the self, everybody's individualistic. Like the individual self is very important still the individual self is important in the bad self, but we're all fallen angels, we're all sinning, we all need to, you know, we're bad essentially. And then I think it then picked up again with, if I believe correctly, the next bit was the good self. And am I right to think this chapter was the beginning of the self-esteem stuff, or was that possibly the chapter after?
It's the next chapter. So like this chapter basically was talking about how there was one interesting bit that I'd like to like look at in depth in my own time, but like it was talking about the difference between like Judaism and Islam, between like and Christianity, and how there's a difference between orthoprax and orthodox. And it was like this idea, wait, let me try and find so it says here, Islam and Judaism are known as orthoprax religions. They're concerned with following the letter of the written holy law, with correct, meaning orth, and practice, praxis, whereas Christianity, meanwhile, is orthodox, concerned with correct, which is orth, and opinion. So it almost introduces a sense of like subjectivity or individual. And I think that's why he was using Christianity as a means of trying to explain that, because that's like the West plus religion rather than East plus religion. And then I think he tried to like bend that and make that go into Freudian, because he started talking about Freud and how basically it's the individual, and you know, because with religion you're trying to repress any like like urge to seek pleasure, right?
Well, yeah.
And then in Freud, you've got these unconscious kind of urges, and that's what he was trying to explain, but scientifically. And then he kind of went into the next chapter where he talks about Esalim Institute and self-esteem and these kind of impulses.
Okay.
In a sense.
Yeah. To be honest, I have to say, when I look at my notes, like upon reflecting, I didn't pick up on that orthodox stuff, but that is interesting, I have to say, in terms of
I just quite like the etymology of it.
Yeah, no, 100%. Like you just said, one of them was by the word. Sorry, like
more literal.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I didn't actually know that was the different. Like, I mean, obviously, you've heard of all these terms before in the past, like orthodox or whatever. Yeah, and you just don't really think about it. But that's quite cool. The main stuff I actually got from this last couple of chapters was this idea of like using mimicry to define modeling. I was fascinated by this entire book, by the whole idea of, because I've read as well about that. What's it called? Wanting by Luke Burgess, which is like mimetic theory, and like we want stuff because other people want it, etc.
Yeah.
And I just found it quite interesting, like this idea that we develop ideal people, or we create models in our culture, and then they influence us. And it would make he articulated the best I've seen yet, which is like, obviously, like we said earlier, when you're born, you want to sort of get ahead, but also get along with everybody, right? And of course, then, if you were scouring your environment and you see people who are ahead and they're well liked, well revered, you would look up to them as a model to mimic and like change your behavior to reflect them, right? And I just found it so, because it just makes so much sense where you have like influencers and all sorts of people on social media, and there's different types of influencers, because they are all essentially these people who we perceive as have got ahead, and obviously with their fans revere them. And their attention, the reason they get so much attention is because people are trying to mimic and work out how they got there, right? And of course you'd want to do that because we're programmed to want to get ahead and be at the top of the social like hierarchy, because if you're at the top of the hierarchy, as everybody like sort of says, you're valued more highly on the mating market, you're more likely to survive, you're more likely to have people backing you up, etc., right? What I find is kind of off topic but slightly interesting is how they then can sell people stuff because of their success. Like, you know, if somebody's good looking, they'll sell you makeup because that's how they got there, but it's not really this their genetics, because they're just beautiful people. And it's like the model's almost the dream, and that's the problem. And another interesting thing is, you know, they say never meet your heroes, and I find that quite interesting because the model you create of somebody isn't actually the most accurate model. And then I was thinking about this recently about relationships as well, because I think a lot of people who, like, let's just say people who, what's the best way of putting it? I feel like when in a relationship, a long-term relationship with somebody like your partner, you get to know them so well. And then I think that their model changes, or like you get to know them so well. And then I think the reason why people sometimes cheat is because they then see somebody else and they put them on a pedestal as because you don't know them well enough to know their complete model. So you put them on like a pedestal of like, oh, that's interesting, they intrigue me. If that kind of makes sense. Like a lot of desire is actually dream based. It's like, this is the model I have of this person. And then you project onto them all the things that you kind of want them to be. Yeah. If that makes sense. And that's what I find quite interesting about this whole idea of models in general, is we put people on a pedestal because they've got ahead or they seem to be ahead. And it's like a lot of people try and show an image of success rather than actually being successful, because everybody knows if they have the image, they then become on people's minds, because people aren't thinking that critically, that like they have got ahead, and therefore they get everybody's attention, and people try and mimic and copy them. I mean, why like the whole self-help industry literally is built off people saying, these are the 12 habits that got me here. This is how I did this. This is how I did that. But they teach you their specific ways they did it, but they don't teach you, like, there's a bit like the sort of Peterson approach, is like the principles of actually just dealing and creating goals and achieving goals. Like that's more in my head, more pragmatic to teach rather than situational stuff, which is like, oh, this happened in my life and whatever. But so I kind of sidetracked there, but it just got me thinking a lot, this book, with especially the stuff, you know, I've been reading, like watching, with the fraud and this idea of mimicking people. And in my head, it's like marketing. If you can prove you're really successful, people then look up to you and you get loads of eyeballs. You're like, wow, that guy's got a Lamborghini. This guy's, you know, he looks really great. He always looks sharp. He is success. But what's interesting as well is once the models are set in society, people then pretend to be the model for deceptive reasons, I think. So like, let's just say we all collectively agree this archetype of person is the person you want to be. You want to be a kind guy who's really rich, who everybody like looks up to or whatever. That's kind of one of the main archetypes probably in modern day capitalism / in America and the UK. Once you have that archetype, people then start creating images of themselves which reflect it. And that is kind of why they say social media influencers are fake as well, because they literally they try and reflect to you the most perfect archetype of what we collectively believe as what we desire, which might not be true, and the reality of it's different.
Yeah.
So I can't on a massive rip.
No. I was just it was just starting to break up a bit at the end.
Okay.
But no, I agree. I think it's interesting because you end up creating a prototype, which no one is that prototype.
Yeah.
And I think it's also interesting when you introduce the fact that, you know, it's very subjective, as in it's your, like we were talking about the self and how the self basically takes all your, you know, memories, your past, your fantasies, your sensory information, your experiences, all this, and molds it into one. Well, then that self also constructs the prototype, doesn't it, of what that ideal person is. So it's very subjective, and it's like you're like you were saying, your role model is never going to be that. You know, because it's like you've created the equivalent of Jordan Peterson, but it's not Jordan Peterson. It's
because you've created a flawless version as well, or you might not have created a flawless version, but you've had to fill in so many gaps because you don't know, you're not that person, right? Yeah. It's like the ideas that we even have of each other will be deeply flawed because there's no way. Like we probably know each other better than most people would know each other just because we're like close friends, right? Yeah. But there are still aspects that you would never know because you're not the person, and it's impossible unless you literally follow them around all day, every day.
Yes, I know everything about you. I know everything. I'm there when you're taking a shit. I'm in the shower watching you. You know?
I was wondering what that camera was doing there. But you kind of know what I mean. Like you have to, because you can't know everything. You can't even know everything about yourself, let alone other people. So you have to fill in the gaps based on certain cues, essentially.
Yeah.
I guess what's quite interesting is a lot of what he talks about is a lot of the cues tend to be other people's attention. So like if this person gets a lot of attention, just by the merit of them getting attention, I then have to want to desire or want to be like that person because of the fact they get attention. And this is why I think a lot of celebrity culture is it's almost luck based, because a lot of them actually don't offer anything apart from just being a celebrity for the sake of it. Yeah. They are literally just a celebrity because they're a celebrity. And once you're there, you're done. Like it's like the first goal is fame. Once you're famous, it's easy. Yeah. But it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. Oh, God, I hate this culture. Like, I hate people that worship others just for the sake of it, and they haven't done anything for it. Like, they don't have any merit for.
I mean, I could talk about it. Just like, I still just be like, for saying that I do watch other people, but I usually watch it for like more intellectual reasons than I do for like, I hate watching people just live their life for like a vlog or something. I just can't understand the motive behind it. Like, I want to watch you just go through your day and open stuff. Like, why would I care? Like, what have you done? I don't know. Anyway,
but like exactly what we've been talking about in terms of like, we look at people to try and understand their behaviors that are making them more successful. So unless they are giving something of value to explain how they are being more successful, then
interestingly, I think off the back of that vlogging, a lot of people thought the best way to grow a YouTube channel was to vlog. No. You're famous first, then you vlog. I'm sorry, nobody becomes famous vlogging, and that is the problem. People then watch them and go, right, I'm going to start vlogging now. Yeah. And like, you get people like,
once again, it's the power law, isn't it? It's like tiny few people do well from vlogging, and then everyone else will try to get on the bandwagon, saturate the whole sector, and then it will still only be like a couple of people that monopolize the whole market.
But then the arms race becomes like, who can be the most outrageous on the vlog, who can get the most attention by doing stuff on their vlogs. Like, I don't know, it's just I've never seen them massive. But I guess from this book I understand why people do watch them, because they're like, this person's got 100,000 followers, they must be like, you're almost there to analyze the person, to be like, how have they done this? Like, what are they doing? Like, and I thought that was probably the book's biggest insight for me, to be honest.
It is interesting because like, if we try to watch people and how they climbed the social hierarchy, right? You've got to have some kind of metric that measures success, right? Money is one thing, but now in a digital world, it's basically like likes and followers and stuff like that. and it almost replaces some form, like it acts as a kind of metric, but it's not a metric of value. It's a metric of,
it's a metric of
I guess
social
you could
value.
say success, but
Metric of social value, like people
Yeah.
liking stuff as social value to be. But
Yeah.
the one thing, any sort of sign or symbol of success can be gamed, because that's like,
Yeah.
it's like, it's one of the oldest things in evolution. Is like, if I can make, myself look like the like a sexy version of your species that you want to come and have sex with, and then I'm actually a Venus flytrap, that's fantastic. Like deception's like, do you get what I mean? It's like normal. It's like the go-to strategy, because it's cheaper than actually being real. Like what's better than actually doing it real is making it making it up. Like it's cheap. Like we said it last podcast, didn't we? Like, it's cheap, it's easy to lie. It's easy to not change reality, just to give off the signals of the thing you're claiming you are.
Yeah.
Like there's been massive like upshoots in like the renting Lamborghini market and stuff like that. It's just like, because people want to give off, like, I think they talked about like on Tinder specifically, like blokes literally rent Lamborghinis to get photos of them so they can have their profile picture with a Lamborghini. Yeah. But funny enough, actually, I thought about this because there's the model of like rich people where everybody's sort of, it's interesting because this is back to like how you define different cultures or different mini tribal cultures within societies differentiate. The middle, lower class, working class have been sold the dream of rich people get Rolexes and they have yachts and they do all these fancy things. Therefore, all these people, if they do become rich, end up, it's called like the new money effect, right? Where they all just spend on all that stuff to show off. Whereas the people who actually are the super rich people are the ones who literally do the counter signals, which is like they just wear like the Zuckerberg or whatever. Warren Buffett, they wear nothing because they're like, well, why do I need to show that I'm so rich?
Yeah.
Like, why? Yeah. I don't need to show it. Like, you're insecure. Like in my head, that's the only reason you would ever do it.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's just, yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, it is funny.
The whole mimetic, looking to others to base your own behavior. Like, we all have to have models because you have to find a way. You have to try and decide what's the best way to act, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So it made so much sense to me. But it's one of these things that I've read all these books on like the human nature, but it was never explained so coherently, I think, than in this book. Like, in terms of like this, like that is actually what we do. We literally scan the environment for people who've got ahead and then try and imitate them based upon also, I think, if they fit your values. So you look for people who are similar to you, I guess, who like they seem to be like, oh, they fit kind of my values and they've done really well. Let's just, see how they did it. And,
yeah.
I mean, looking at biographies, the whole book industry of biographies is based off people trying to figure out how people became successful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But I think then there's a level of cynicism that comes into people when they start realizing that actually a lot of it can actually be image projection rather than actually being successful. But then also it depends on your definition of successful, right? Because a lot of people, like I said before, we project these models of perfection. And then you find out when you meet these people, although they're really successful in one area, they usually like had 3 wives and got divorced 3 times because they're completely overworking or something. Do you get what I mean? Like, they're not actually, they don't have like a good home life. Their kids have like, you get what I mean? That there's like certain trade-offs.
Your life is made up of multiple different value structures, and some of them people might be really fucking good at, but obviously it's a trade-off. You have only so much time, and so others will probably be fucking, really shit. Hence why some people might be able to work and be the best at what they do, but yeah, like you just said, their family's gone to shit. They've been divorced twice. Their kids don't speak.
And also that's funny because there's almost me giving a value judgment there that you shouldn't be doing that. But fair enough, that person probably believes, I don't know, that doesn't matter for them because they've done it 3 times in terms of like divorcing, etc. Because you get what I mean. Like, some people don't care. Like, that's not their values. They're like, well, I wasn't happy, so I'll move on. It's fair enough.
Yeah,
it is fair enough. Like we're making just like rash judgments there, but realistically, it's where do people put their attention? And like, there was a quote which is like, never wish you could trade somebody's life. Never wish you could trade places with somebody unless you know exactly what their life's like, because you don't.
Yeah.
You think, you want to be the head of this, you want to be a billionaire. Okay, well then you've got to own like 10 companies. Imagine the stress of running 10 companies and, and all the media flack you're going to get. Like, I don't know. But yeah, sorry, that was, I think that was in the good self, but
yeah. Well, I think we were pretty much going into that chapter anyway. And
we were going into the special self, right? In my head.
Well, I thought basically like
I didn't really get anything.
What from what? The good self?
Yeah, I didn't really get any. We could literally just go right now.
The Easterlin Institute. It sounded like a fun time. Basically, this kind of institute in California that was started by. It was kind of started by the ideology of like Aldous Huxley, and how basically if all the potential is born, like if every individual has so much potential, then it's all about basically curating and creating that that potential into something. And then so you had Carl Rogers, who's like a big figure in psychology, because he like came up with this humanistic psychology, and basically the idea that like all people are inherently good, and basically all they all their problems are basically based around their environmental problems. So as long as you can kind of sort that out, then a person will be all good, and then they can self-actualize and then self-transcend. And that's where like Abraham Maslow kind of comes in with his kind of hierarchy.
Yeah.
But yeah, this institute was basically started up, and it was basically like a therapy session for groups of people that was trying to figure out who the real you was, so that you could realize and accept that, and then you'd be like, that would be your goodness in a sense, I guess. And then try and like, what's the word? Like, I don't know, try and promote that. And it kind of, I tell you what's so weird though, is that this kind of thing that he was doing is so much like my acting method that I use. Called Meisner method. Like it's just so similar, whereby the whole idea is you're trying to deconstruct all this kind of social conditioning that you're so used to in society, to try and figure out like what your actual impulses are, what's your natural impulses to something, rather than like what's your impulse to something because loads of people are watching you or something like that.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so it's trying to strip that all away, figure out what the real you is, and then you can like, go from there. But yeah, then this kind of like, it got a bit fucking weird, didn't it? Like, didn't loads of people start to commit suicide at this institute?
Oh God, yes. No, I remember this chapter now. Yes.
Yeah.
He went to this place, didn't he? He went and.
Am I right? He went there.
Yeah, it was like it. Yeah, got you. I remember it, and it was with some weird person who, like, they basically made you be whoever you wanted to be. Like, he basically said he was scared of being a prick or something, and he went around just insulting people for, like, this is the chapter, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I remember the chapter now. Yeah. It was crazy, actually. Yeah, it was like they were trying to release their inner, or the thing they're most scared of being, so like what culture's conditioned them to not be.
Yes.
They were allowed to, like, release. So his was like being a douche. So he spent a couple of days going around basically insulting people.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, like you said, at the end of it, I think you're right. Some people basically actually killed themselves or something ridiculous like that.
Yeah, and I think the reason why like he introduced this kind of like approach was so basically everyone's in a group, right? There's like a group of people, and one person is kind of acting or is told to do something, and the teacher is trying to determine what's real and what's not, right? Trying to, distinguish the difference. And then once you figure out who you are, then they're trying to like give you a lot of respect and everything like that. And this is where the whole self-esteem thing starts to come from, in a sense, because it's like, you can be who you are. All you need to do is like believe, and that's enough. And then I think that kind of goes into the next chapter, which is what is it?
The special self.
The special self.
The special self.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this, I mean, to be honest, I'm going to try and. This had the neoliberalism in it as well, because I think it started off with Ayn Rand. Her name's like something Rosenbaum, but Ayn Rand, who wrote Atlas Shrugged. Yeah. His basic argument is the power of the individual, isn't it? It's the idea that, the individual is great and that they can go on to achieve great things. And in the book, he talks about this idea that it brought across neoliberalism. It influenced, who was it? Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve. It basically impacted the whole economic situation of America, because it allowed for more liberal policies towards sort of the markets, more laissez-faire approach to economics and capitalism. But anyway, besides the point, that was kind of like the underlying inspiration, the power of the individual based upon the good self, and that everybody's, the voice and the free market, etc. And it led to I can't remember the guy's name now, but do you remember his name? The guy who wanted to do the self-esteem, the guy who basically
John
self-esteem
Vasconcello, that guy,
something like that, right? And he kind of basically got into bed, or he was always big on that self-esteem could improve the economy, could improve the country, because if everybody had good self-esteem, people would believe in themselves, and therefore they would work harder at work. We would create more projects. We'd be more innovative, etc. Right? And the crux of it wasn't it? He was trying to persuade politicians to fund a self-esteem movement, which essentially would mean funding schools to basically pay more attention to kids and build up their self-esteem through basically encouraging them no matter how they performed at school. So like if they did something bad, they'd be like, oh, don't worry, you're great, you're amazing. So basically a load of compliments to basically just encouraging kids no matter the situation, even if it's a bad mark or a good mark. And like you said, the rationale behind it was, if kids believe in themselves and have good self-esteem, then they're going to perform better in the economy. He managed to persuade politicians by creating research, wasn't it, with the University of California, was it? It was I think it was California at least.
Yeah.
And basically the crux of it is the research was pretty much inconclusive. It kind of said there is a correlation here, but there's nothing, foolproof. But the media spin, which also we could talk about how media can spin stuff and take it to common knowledge without people realizing the science was inconclusive. But anyway, this led to the funding being given, and essentially this idea that I don't even know if it's all schools, but just it started being funded in schools for kids to be encouraged no matter what, right? And I think on this chapter as well, he made a very good point about the idea of like social pain. And I have my own opinions of the purpose of pain. For example, if you touch something too hot, it tells you to not touch it again because obviously it's going to cause some damage. In terms of social pain, in terms of being insulted, in terms of being shamed to a degree, I'm not saying it's good in terms of like, shaming somebody to the point of oblivion, but shaming people to guide them to better action is not something to be avoided. It's something to be encouraged, to encourage people to behave or to adapt the way they act. So the example I would give is, if a kid's really struggling at school, not doing great, and you're still going, yeah, fantastic, you're great, you're special, you're amazing, like you're failing, but you're so good, like you're great. Like, how is that going to make them change to put more effort in or to, to learn harder or whatever? But that was my overall synopsis of the chapter. I'm pretty sure I must have missed out a bunch of things there, but you jump in with anything you've took from it.
There was quite a lot in it. I linked it a lot to Roy Baumeister's book of Evil, because he mentioned self-esteem in that, and there used to be this, especially since this since this push of self-esteem in the 70s and 80s or whatever it was. I think it was then. That higher self-esteem was, really beneficial, and it was going to reduce unemployment and, improve productivity. And because there was this, there was also this period during the economic crisis of the Great Compression or something, they needed a lot of people, they needed more productivity and stuff like that. And so this was kind of like the perfect answer. And so it kind of slotted in nicely in that sense. But also, like you said, he basically used his power to pressure the university into accepting it and to kind of skewing the results slightly. But
I think he cherry picked the sentences rather than skewing the results, right? He kind of cherry picked, Yeah, because they were in between a rock and a hard place. They couldn't say no because then their funding would have stopped, and But what was interesting is in this book, Evil, Roy Baumeister shows that basically it's actually people who have high self-esteem or inflated self-esteem react more aggressively. So there's a difference between calibrated and non-calibrated. Yeah, I was gonna. Can I just jump? Sorry, can I just jump in with the idea that it was believed before that low self-esteem was the cause of violence as well. So this almost leads into why they wanted higher self-esteem, is because they believed that low self-esteem led to criminality and violence or whatever.
Yes. Yeah. No. Exactly. And Yeah, so he basically showed that it's actually the opposite. It's having inflated self-esteem. Because if you have this inflated self-esteem, if you see yourself up here when really you're here, and you're interacting with loads of people and they're treating you on this level, then you might interpret them as being malicious towards you or aggressive towards you.
Yeah.
And that's what he kind of talks about in his book. And so it's actually linked to like higher levels of aggression. And I think it's quite interesting that, you know, talking about this kind of calibrated, uncalibrated self-esteem, because if you were, I think he gives an example in this book, like if you're Einstein and someone calls you dumb, you're not going to get offended because you know you're fucking Einstein, right? Like, whereas if you generally,
it's a bit like what I said earlier, right?
Yeah. So, you know, if you think you're up here when really you're here and they tell you about something here, then that might, like you said earlier on, might take it to heart if you're actually fat. You know, going back to that
I think is a level of shattered assumptions though, isn't it, as well? Like when somebody completely breaks where you think you are, you're almost the fight or flight response. You're basically, the emotions in you come sort of make you feel anxious almost, right? And you're then wired to respond either aggressively or cowardly, I guess. And then if you're aggressive and you've got high self-esteem, it's a double whammy, isn't it?
Exactly. And what's interesting is that, you know, a narcissist. So he talks about narcissism a lot, and how basically inflated ideas of self-worth are basically narcissistic, and they come with, you know, being a narcissist has a lot of problems of itself. So they were basically saying that they've done studies since, I think it was like 70s or prior to the 70s, and then up until like 2000. They said since the period in which the self-esteem movement was pushed, narcissism levels have shot up. Because you have people who are just being told, no, you are much better than the skill competency that you have. You know? And so they have this inflated idea of themselves.
It's like, it was something like 30%. The 30% increase, ridiculous. I think, was from the book, or something ridiculous. Like that is huge.
That's
and it wasn't it to do with like mainly like college. It was like educated people as well, which is even, in my opinion, is even worse. Because if you remember the book on the mistakes were made, it talks about this like people who are educated genuinely do over believe in themselves because they believe, because they've been educated, they know everything. So being educated and being narcissistic, that's a double whammy. That is. Because, I mean, education in a sense always actually breeds a level of narcissism, because you then believe you know best on what you've studied, right?
I think going back to your point about like role models and mimicry, I think this is where the problem comes in, because if you're in a neoliberal kind of climate, right, that promotes people being of a certain type of personality in a sense, or like having high levels of self-esteem in order to be successful in a market, then what you're going to see is the people who are the most successful are probably the ones who are most kind of narcissistic in a sense, you know, and so then we're looking at the people who are succeeding in society, and we're going like, he does this, and this. Despite he's narcissistic, loads of people are going to copy his methods of getting and obtaining success. So then you're just breeding this like cycle of narcissism. And it's like interesting to think that, you know, the way a kind of market or a society is set up is like, we're all nested in that and we're all assimilated into that. Do you get what I mean? As in, like, if the market system was to change in some way, it wasn't so liberal in that sense, then maybe we would all be slightly different people, because people who succeed in that market would have to have a different like different skills.
Therefore, the models of the culture would be different. Therefore, the people you look up to and the people you model the behavior on would be different. 100%. No. Exactly. Of course, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Which is also really interesting. Why this Wolf of Wall Street, Jordan Belfort.
I was going to mention him earlier on.
I was just like what the fuck? Like, he's a criminal, and this is why I love like the CoffeeZilla stuff I'm watching at the moment, because he's just like, why are we at a stage where in culture he is rewarded? He was put in prison for 6 years. He literally stole people's money. He's a cunt, like in the nicest way possible,
and he's still like paying it back, and like, but he's doing it like so little bits.
No, but people, like loads of blokes always like post pictures, and I get why they do it. It's because realistically, if you look at like the evolutionary reasons, he had the money, he had the status, he had lots of like naked chicks around him. So that's why blokes are like, oh my God, he's the boy. Like, look at him. In fact, if anything, the thing that's actually put him on a pedestal is the movie. If it wasn't for the movie, he would not be be famous. I'm telling you, if it wasn't for the movie, that movie has distorted public's opinions of Jordan Belfort by a mile. Like, we wouldn't know who he was. I wouldn't know who he was if it wasn't for the movie.
Don't get me wrong. Like, I love the movie, okay? But what you're sending a signal to people that basically this guy committed all of these like crimes against the values that we hold in our society, and we're going to make him more successful now by making a movie about him. Like, do you get what I mean? And kind of almost praise.
Well,
but
I think in an interesting way, he was portrayed with his drug use at the end. I feel like he almost got portrayed as a man out of control, and therefore he was forgivable. I think, I don't know, in a weird way. I kind of if you watch it, you almost feel sorry for him by the end of it. Do you kind of get me? Because his life's fallen apart so much. But
I get you, but it's because you don't see the other side at all. Like, at all. You don't see the people who struggled and who put their money into it and then lost all their money. And that's why, like, the film is so kind of one direction.
Yeah.
But it is like...
But no, it's the perfect example of the model thing. It is. Yeah. It's like, wow, he's revered in society. Like, what does that tell you about people? Like,
and also, I think what you're going to find is that there are loads of situations in the market that aren't scripted by laws and that basically rely on someone's values and like moral integrity to make the right decision, right? Because it's not scripted by a rule. The rule doesn't say, like, you might be in a circumstance where you're trying to negotiate or something and there is a law present, and so you have to try and just figure it out on your own or with that other person. But that's where the kind of requirement for someone to make the right decision happens. But a lot of the time you get the complete opposite, because it's like, well, I can get away with this, so why wouldn't I? You know?
So it's not illegal, so why?
Yeah, exactly. And I think you've like talked about this a bit in terms of fraud, because there's so many like areas, like loopholes,
or
which aren't illegal, but like aren't what you would consider right or good. But
it's, they basically use the law as a moral guidance when it's not really moral guidance. Like, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should.
But this is what like we've talked about so many times in terms of like, what if, like we were just mentioning now, selfish and selfless is based on what your culture defines. And if your culture is basically promoting you to make as much money as possible, in no matter what kind of means.
Yeah. If that's what all the models are doing, like if that's what, then, when you look at media and see like these people are revered and they're basically cheaters and liars and scumbags essentially, then, and it also gives you that mindset of like, if they can get away with it, why can't I? Like, if they haven't been punished, why should I be punished?
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. And, you know, you've got the biggest corporations and companies in the world that don't pay tax because they can find a loophole by, you know, working in Ireland or something. And you're like, fucking hell. Like, you know, just not really setting an example, but yeah.
No, I completely agree with it. If you see the amount they save as well, it's just like, it's disgusting to us.
It's actually disgusting.
It is. It's not good at all. I'm trying to think. Where are we?
So I think that was pretty much all I have. I think you summed up the.
Yeah, that's all I have in the special self. So, like essentially, we got to the point. Let's just try and summarize. We got from the point where it was, you know, we started off with the suicide. Like, why are people, you know, not being able to live up to the models or whatever? Then we got into the tribal self, so the being, you know, how the self is molded by the tribe and culture. Then we had the perfectible self, I believe, which was the sort of origins of the Greek individualistic thought and the improvement of the predictable self. And then we had the bad self, which is the Christian influence, followed by the good self, which is like, you know, believing in your own impulses and, you know, we're all inherently good relatively. We just need the, you know,
the support,
the means,
and
encouragement. And then we moved into support. Yeah, that's it. And then that led obviously to the self-esteem movement, which sort of led to outright lying to people, in my opinion. But, you know, just basically, you know, self-esteem is more important than truth, essentially. Put people's feelings above anything else. Everybody's got their own internal truth, And then I think the final chapter was the digital self.
Yeah.
I didn't particularly get too many notes on this because he just went on a long
yeah.
parade about a woman who took loads of selfies. And I was a bit like, you could have said so many different things, but all you took is this one girl who's obviously neurotic and who takes loads of selfies. I was like, mate, come on, just use people's examples of like the most, how everybody just portrays the perfect life. I thought he was going to go down that route, but he didn't. Yeah. He literally went on to one girl who takes like 100 selfies a day and basically is a psychopath because she breaks boys' hearts for a living. And I was like, what the fuck is this?
I know. I was actually quite surprised. I thought it was slightly, weirdly, a bit anticlimactic. I thought it didn't tie it back round to the kind of, the perfect self.
So we're going to tie it for you. Because in my head, that whole chapter should literally have been about, moving from this whole self-esteem moving obviously into the digital platforms where now we know the models, we know the rules, therefore everybody's trying to portray the sort of ideal self on social media.
Yeah.
And whether or not that is, but then also, then that informs other people of how they should be behaving, because essentially every single post on social media, is a bit of information, a bit of cultural information, which you then have to assimilate and realize, oh, is that what my life should be like?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that is kind of where we got to this like clusterfuck of people basically portraying things which the highlight reels of their life where they're doing the best things, they're giving the best gifts or whatever, or they're being really romantic, or they're doing all this. People are showing off things and creating frames and angles of their life, which is completely unrealistic. And then this is causing other people who get their cultural information from other people to realize, oh my God, I didn't do that. I could never be like that. That's just too perfect.
Yeah.
And we got like a group of people who are trying to like out perfect each other in terms of like the best looking life on online.
Yeah.
And obviously, like we said back to like the first chapter, which is like unattainable levels. What does this do for people who literally can't attain these lifestyles? Because the people who are the most famous actually get given half the shit. Like the people who portray the best lives get like these free holidays to go to the Bahamas. They get these free, Rolexes or whatever to wear and show off. They're not paying for that.
Yeah.
They're just showing it to you to show they got the best life possible, and then you beat yourself up because you can't go do that. You can't just go take a 6-month vacation around the Bahamas in your nice Rolex with your 6-pack abs and
yeah, exactly.
And it's crazy, isn't it?
Weirdly, it's just like it's so competitive, and yet it makes sense because. First of all, it's like a market, if this is a very neoliberal climate and it's all about just working within the market, then you're breeding an element of competition, and some people are going to do better than others. So you're always going to have like a kind of monopoly in a sense. And so the same thing kind of goes for social media, where you just constantly compare yourself to everyone, almost to try and understand a standard at which you should be. But the problem is that you probably shouldn't even be in that kind of hierarchy in the first place. And this is what he kind of talks about, whereby we all have different personalities, we're all drawn to different things. Some people are more genetically inclined to be better at being a negotiator than someone else who's like quite timid but is really good at making pottery. It's like you're not in the same fucking hierarchies here, and yet you're comparing the top point as if they were. Do you get what I mean? As in, like, success is just success. It doesn't matter what hierarchy you're in to get there. And so people just end up trying to portray their lives as this thing without any kind of means to get there. It kind of doesn't make much sense, but
yeah. I was gonna say it's interesting because a lot of these what's successful in social media actually reveals, or like these lives that we all like want to have, almost reveal a lot about human nature, which is like we all want to get ahead, we all want to look beautiful, we all want to basically not work. We want to be just enjoying ourselves, in the sun somewhere. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's like we want it all. That's it. We want it all. We want the best, and essentially that's what's being reflected back to us for our consumption of the sort of Instagram and stuff. In my head, and then what we then realize is we all fall very short of the best because there's only an elite few who can get that, and that is sadly the truth. But all the self-help would tell you, it's just your self-esteem. If only you believed. If only you, you did the thinking fast and grow rich, and you materialize it using The Secret. You just, you will it into existence
Yeah,
without
exactly.
doing any exercise or having any diets. You just will it. Like, oh yes, come on.
No amount of thinking is going to
like
break away that kind of genetic direction that you've been sent in, you know? I think it is interesting because,
but not even just that. It's like, yeah, I was going to say, it's just like the idea that, you know, you can just will things like, oh yeah, you know, every day I sit there and I shout mantras. I'm going to be rich. I'm going to be rich. I'm going to be rich. I'm going to, no, that's my 5 done for the day. Right, I'm going to wait 10 years and I'm going to be on a yacht. It's fuck off, mate. Just go do some work, man.
People are so deluded.
I mean, don't get me wrong. There is some truth to, like, I get it. Like having a bit of
optimism and visualizing.
Yeah, optimism, confidence building.
But it's basically just more optionality, isn't it? It's like basically having a certain kind. You're basically training your attention to pick up on cues that are most relevant for the thing that you want.
Or opportunities.
Yeah, so exactly. So, you know, if you constantly just told yourself about money, you'd probably be a bit more aware about money, like opportunities around.
You turn into a crook.
No, you probably actually would be like more tuned to certain things like that. But
well, because it's much easier to deceive somebody than it is to build a functional business. It's much easier to just outright fraudulently just take money from somebody than it is to actually do something valuable, in my opinion. So the money probably would take you that direction. Also,
what's interesting is, like, so I've been doing this research project at uni, and I'm looking at people high in dark triad traits, particularly like Machiavellianism. And one of the papers that I had to analyze last week or something was about whether people high in Machiavellianism would be able to spot more profit opportunities because they're more, like, you know, strategic.
Okay.
But in particular, illegal or legal. Okay, so illegal or legal opportunities. Okay. But weirdly, your brain doesn't know the difference between legal and illegal, right? It's just looking for a profit opportunity. No, and weirdly, if we're thinking about this book, and now you're just full of people who are narcissistic, who are just looking for a means of being very materialistic and acquiring money, you probably got a lot more people who are a lot more attuned to basically picking up on a legal means of acquiring that.
Yes.
Which is kind of...
Yes. Look at the crypto industry. Look at the crypto. Like, honestly, you need to watch some CoffeeZilla. Like, the stuff that's going on in that space is fucking ridiculous. Honestly. And it's all young people who are all more likely to be narcissistic through their recent education experiences. Yeah. And they're all deluded, though. Like, a lot of it is actually self-delusion. It's like they genuinely believe... They also believe, like you said, it's not illegal. So what's the harm? What's the harm in perpetuating something like, oh, this coin is going to go, you know, it's going to be really valuable in the future? What's wrong with doing that? Because people know the risk. It's seductive. I've even contemplated, like, you're like, oh, you could just create a coin and people pay loads of money for it. But then it's like, you've got to bring yourself back to the reason, like, you know, deep down that coin isn't going to be worth anything.
Yeah.
Do you kind of get me? Like, unless of course you're really invested in it, you've actually created something that's new.
Yeah,
it's just and it's nuts what's going on in that area. But yeah,
there's almost an attitude that there's no consequences, and that they don't need to work with any other people because of this individualistic attitude. Do you know what I mean? So it's just all on them. It doesn't matter. They'll do it, and because it's just for themselves, and that's what individualism is really. But no consideration.
But the whole point, I guess, with the individual, it's so funny because I'm to and fro between, like, free market capitalism / you know, let people be people, but then also I'm well aware of the importance of government and regulation. Like, I'm so down the middle at the moment that it's hard, because I can absolutely see the problem is when you let people go to them, if you let people do what they want to do, there are bad actors to take advantage of those situations. So you need regulations to stop the bad actors. But when the bad actors then, deified, and then everybody starts doing it, the government can't crack down enough on.
Yeah.
If everybody's doing it, who's at fault, right? It's the same thing with, like, the firing squads in Germany. Like, if everybody was doing it, therefore it's okay. Like, everybody else is doing it. Like, I'm not to blame because we're all here, doing bad things, but because we're doing it together, it's not bad.
Yeah.
It's a slippery slope. But I think we spoke quite a lot about this idea of, like, trust in society and stuff. And I do think it's fragile. It is fragile. And I'm starting to,
I think that's the kind of job of the state, in the sense that, like, I'm libertarian in the sense that I think, free markets are good, to an extent, but I think the problem where it goes wrong is when there isn't like moral, like that people aren't held morally accountable for things. It's not so much the fact that like I'm all for like competition and people striving to work hard to create things of their own and, you know, prosper from that. But it's like it's got to be done with noble means. You know, otherwise, if everyone just cheats to get to the top, well, then everyone's a cheater, and then you know you've got a dominant.
I guess another weird idea I've just literally thought of is like, you know how you need to be reminded of the rules to a degree. Like we all kind of know the rules, like the law and stuff. You know how in like newspapers occasionally get the very high profile like criminal cases. You should actually be told about criminal cases more, just so you understand that, you know, the people who are committing crimes are getting put away. Because for all I know, I've never seen anybody get put away, so I don't know this is even fucking happening. But if they like every day you had a digestion of like, you know, this is the cases that happened this week. These people got put away for this, this, and this. You start realizing like, you know, stuff's actually been done. People are getting. And then, for example, like if I started seeing that and I was somebody who was thinking of committing crime, I'd be like, fuck, you know, people are getting caught.
Yeah.
Because I feel like a lot of people just think they're relatively invincible and they just get along with it.
I think there needs to be, like, for someone to do something, you need either a fear or an incentive, or ideally, in a sense, both, right? So like in this example that you're talking about, reminding people of what happens if you don't, you know, abide by these kind of moral standards, but then also the benefit that comes about from abiding by these moral standards, you know. And I think like both of those, because basically what's happened is it's just become so detached from our society that it basically needs to be ingrained in again. And realistically, that's not going to happen for another couple of generations. But you've got to start at some point. But you know, if we keep going the way we're going, then I think, you know, the kind of distribution or inequality of wealth is going to be even more ridiculous than it already is. And people just,
it's going to be, I think it's going to have to sort itself out, and it's getting a bit crazy, especially this new COVID. But we'll end it there. I think that was a good overall summary, and then we could just chat a little bit after.
Yeah. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, guys. If you did, make sure to leave us a like or a comment. We'd love to hear what you thought about it. Also, make sure you subscribe so that you can be made aware when we next bring out another episode. Next week, we are going to be reviewing a very short introduction of Jung, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And also, the following week, we are looking to do A Cultural Animal by Roy Baumeister. So if those sound interesting, make sure you tune in because they are going to be great. But until then, have a good one.